tonight. We're going to pick back up. We covered in the last chapter human responsibilities, and we talked about the relationship of husbands to wives, and wives to husbands, and children to their parents, and masters to, or slaves to their master. And we finish out that particular thought as we go into the first verse of this chapter with the relationship between servants and masters. And starting with verse 1, it says, "Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." So that first verse concludes that particular line of thinking. If we look at this breakout of chapter 4, we conclude the thought and finished in chapter 3, and then we're told about steadfast prayer in verses 2 through 4, walking wisely among those that are not Christians in verses 5 through 6. And then there's a statement that Tychicus would inform the Colossians about Paul's current state and his condition and his labor there in Rome. And then finally it concludes the book with the greetings that Paul passes along to the people there at Colossae, Laodicea, and to specific brethren. So that's kind of a quick outline of the verses that we'll be covering tonight. It's important as we go through the greetings that we're going to see a reiteration of a number of Paul's companions. We had a kind of a quick review of these before, but these are the key players in the book of Colossians and in the book of Philemon, which is a companion note to this. And if we go back to Ephesians and finding others that are there with Paul in Rome as he's writing the letter, we see the full list of characters that come to play. Timothy is there with Paul in Rome. In Colossians 1 and 1, Epaphras has come to Rome to give Paul a report, and as a result of that, he is now detained there in Rome as a fellow slave, or not a slave, but a fellow bondservant, fellow prisoner is the wording. Tychicus and Onesimus will be the ones delivering the letter to the Colossians. Aristarchus, there in Colossae, one of the ones that is preaching and teaching. Luke, who is with Paul in Rome, and is referred to in Colossians 4:14, let's see tonight, the beloved physician. That's where we learn more about him. Mark, who is Barnabas' nephew, relative, is mentioned here in Colossians 4 and 10. Justus, who's also named Jesus, Colossians 4 and 11 and 14 is mentioned. And then Demas, who is also mentioned in Colossians 4 and 11. We know later on in 2 Timothy 4 and 10 that he forsook Paul because he loved this present world. So those are the companions and the key characters that come to play, and just as a refresher to our memory on this. So our human responsibilities and the masters and their relationship to the servants. We've talked a bit about this. We talked about it Sunday in the relationship to servants, to their masters. You know, and in that day and time, it had its own problems, even as it has in our own history of the United States. But it's not condemned here. Certainly in today's culture, it would have been frowned upon, but there were guidelines given specifically. And in verse 1, what does the passage say as it relates to how masters are to treat their servants? Just and equal, just and fair. The letter to Philemon tells him specific things that he is to treat regarding Onesimus. He's to treat him what? As a brother. Okay, so there's no inhumane treatment that's going on. They're commanded to be treating them very fairly. If we look at how bondservants are treated, Matthew 20 and 1 through 16 talks about it as well, how they're to be treated just and fairly. In Matthew 21 through 16, it talks about the laborers. If we equate a servant to a laborer, someone that's being paid, there were brought in, and a certain landowner had work that needed to be done. He went out and got some people at the first hour of the day, and then throughout the day he kept bringing them in. And at the end of the day, what had he done? He had brought in a group of people all day long and offered them work. The storyline behind that is that some of the laborers complained when they all got paid, because they all got paid the same thing, did they not? And what did the master say? You agreed to it. I paid you fair and just rewards. And that's an example of how the master was supposed to treat those laborers and how the relationship should exist there. Those that we equate it today between laborers in the previous verses, how they're not to do it with eye service as men pleasers. And then in this passage, if masters, if we're an employer, we're to treat our employees fairly. The justification for why they were supposed to do this is told in the last part of verse 1. It says, you're to treat them justly and fairly, knowing what? You too have a master. Specifically, who's the master? God is, okay? Romans 14 and 12, let's look particularly at that right quick. In Romans 14 and 12, when somebody gets there before I do, go ahead and read it. Okay, that's our master. We're going to give our account to him specifically. And here in Colossians 1, it doesn't say God in particular, but it does. It says master in heaven. So, examples. We look back at other examples of people that were servants and how they were treated. It's interesting to look at the characteristics throughout the Old Testament. Abraham had an abundance of servants, did he not? He was considered one of the greatest, wealthiest people of his day. And how did he treat his servants? He saw to their needs. He gave them with respect. He used one of his servants to actually go out and find a wife for his son. That's not the kind of connotations that we carry with the idea of a servant or a slave in our mindset. Certainly, Abraham treated his, quote, employees or his slaves or his bondservants very well. In the next comparison, by contrast, what do we know about Laban and how he treated Jacob? I think he said he changed his wages, was it 7 times? He's did it over and over again. Most notably, what did Jacob agree to do? He would work for what? For wife. Rachel specifically. Okay? And we know that on the first pass through that, who did he end up with? Leah. Through trickery as well. So there's dishonesty throughout that. We know that after he got his wives, he started working for animals and livestock. So as he tended the flock, he was given certain types of animals. And as those numbers of animals multiplied, what did Laban do? Change the type. Okay, so there's nothing honest and honorable about what Laban did and how he treated Jacob. And those are 2 biblical examples of how a servant should be treated and how they shouldn't be treating, or how a master should be treating his servants and how a master should not be treating his servants. We could look at others by comparison, but I think those are 2 really good examples. Verses 2 through 4 talk about continuing steadfastly in prayer. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. The characteristics of the prayer as we talk through this are earnest prayer. When the disciples were first baptized and they were worshiping together, what does Acts 2 and 42 say that they did? They continued steadfastly, okay? That's an ongoing behavior. It's not a one-time thing. It's an active participation. So we see steadfast in prayer, steadfast there in what they did in Acts 2 and 42. Talks about being vigilant, keeping awake, not ritualistic. We don't need to just come in and say a prayer to say a prayer. If we recite the same thing over and over again, does it really, what does it do? It becomes routine. Oftentimes when we sit down for a meal, we give thanks for our food, and we may only just give that same quick prayer that we gave thanks for our food, without giving additional thought to the other things at that very moment we could be thankful for. I'm guilty of that. That's why I'm using that example. Keeping awake implies that you're continually steadfast. Being vigilant means that you're a constant watch. And not ritualistic means that you're paying attention to what you're doing. So all of these imply that you're keenly aware of what you're doing in your prayer, so that you are on top of the importance of that prayer and applying it to get the best benefit out of it. He says being watchful in it with thanksgiving. One of the components of prayer is thankfulness. We thank God for our blessings. In the first 2 chapters of this book, we talked about the blessings that the Colossians were bestowed upon. And in Ephesians, the first half of the book talks about the blessings that they have in Christ. They are, as a result, to be watchful in that thanksgiving. Paul specifically talks to them to include in their prayers mention of others. He particularly, on his behalf, mentions himself. Why did he ask them to pray for him? Was it for his health and wealth? No, it wasn't anything self-serving. What did Paul want to be able to do? Open a door for him. So it wasn't for him personally so that he would gain in any way. It was so that God could be glorified. It was a very selfless act, but it was his mission to do that, and he's asking for their prayers on his behalf to be able to fulfill that mission. So that God would open a door so that the word could be spread. Particularly in the spreading of the word, what message do they want to declare? It's the next phrase, the mystery of Christ. He makes the point, this is the whole reason I'm in prison, is because of that mystery. So with thanksgiving, they're to pray. They're praying for Paul and his companions. In Ephesians 6:20, he talks about be bold and teach as he ought. That's one of his asks for the prayer. And then he moves on to talking about how individuals are to walk, and how they walk among non-Christians, and how they're to behave. He picks up in verse 4, and actually verse 5, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer every person. We have specific guidance as it relates to how elders are to have a good report of non-Christians, lest any have a snare of the devil for them. It's an important feature if they're trying to teach a non-Christian that someone doesn't raise something up about their language or how they're talking to others, or that they're inconsistent in any other way. That's a very specific example of an application of this verse. We see examples in the Old Testament of how individuals conducted themselves under great adversity and how they were respected among their non-brethren as a result of that. What do we know about Joseph? Humble beginnings, were they not? When he went down to Egypt, what was he? He was a slave. By virtue of his behavior in Potiphar's house, how did he rise up? Second in command of the nation eventually, but he was also second in charge in Potiphar's house until Potiphar's wife lied against him. When he was in prison, how was he elevated? keeper of the prison, put him in charge of doing things there as well. And then we see after the revealing of the dreams, how God elevated him in the sight of Pharaoh to be able to put him as second in control of the nation. Do you think Joseph, well, first off, we know that Joseph was providentially put there for that reason. But I have to think that Joseph's behavior in and of itself had a lot to do with how he was recognized and how he continued to be elevated. He obviously was a hard worker. It's doubtful that he was foul language, though we don't have specifics of that in the text. But we know about his character. And if we think here of how an individual is to conduct themselves with respect to speech and walking wisely, Joseph's a good example of that. Daniel, one of the princes of, so to speak, of Israel, Judah, and carried away into captivity in the first round. As a result of that, we see him being put with other young people, and what does he first do? He sets himself apart by asking that they be able to eat the food that they would normally eat and not things that would defile themselves. His character is immediately exhibited. By virtue of interpreting the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, he's elevated to a leadership position within the country. Ultimately, we know at the very tail end of his life and at the tail end of the story associated with Daniel, what position had he risen to? It said he was third in the kingdom, behind the two leaders. No doubt Daniel's character had a great deal to do. His wisdom and how he walked among the people and how he conducted himself had a lot to do with that. And God's providence, no doubt, as well. Let your speech always be gracious. This was one of Brother Rollins' favorite verses he made you memorize. So I remember this one from 12th grade Bible. But if we drop back to Proverbs 15, we see this reiterated by the psalmist over and over again in this one passage. Here the verse says, let your speech be always gracious, seasoned with salt. What does salt do for food? Somebody said it gives it flavor. Okay, it preserves it. In many cases, people say it makes it better. It enhances it. Okay? If our speech is seasoned with salt, it is giving the idea that it enhances it. Okay? So that you may know what you ought to answer every person. We have other passages that talk about us studying so that we know how to give an answer for every question that we receive. Here it's talking about know how to answer in a way. But in Proverbs 15, starting with verse 1, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Verse 2, the tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. Verse 4, a wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach to the spirit. Verse 14, the heart of him that hath understanding seeketh knowledge, but the mouth of fools feedeth on foolishness. And then verse 26, he that is greedy of gain troubleth his, that's verse 27. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant words. All of those are complementary in the same idea, in that pleasant words, in that words that encourage others, non-foolish words are favorable to other language. Any comments on this section? That's correct. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge. There's a lot to be said. We know that how we communicate is important. There are great communicators that can sway the opinion of people by how they talk and how they deliver a message, regardless of what the message is. That's not what we're talking about here. We want to deliver, obviously, the wisdom of the Word as we teach others, but we need to be mindful of how we approach others about it. If we approach a non-Christian in a confrontational way immediately. When we're confronted confrontationally, what's our first reaction? We're going to bow up and bear back. If we approach somebody in the same way with the word regarding the gospel, the immediate will start to shut down. So we need to find common ground that we can actually talk to and build on to carry that conversation forward. In verse 7 through 9, Tychicus will tell you about me. And this is Paul saying to the Colossians, now I'm going to tell you a bit about me, about the current situation. And he says in verses 7 through 9, he'll tell you about all of my activities. He is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and a fellow servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know we are and that we may encourage your hearts. How we are and that we may encourage your hearts. And with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. They will tell you everything that has taken place here. Tychicus would relay Paul's activities. No doubt he's going to give a report on Paul's captivity, the current state potentially of the trial, how he's being treated, his health condition, and the extent of how the gospel is spreading as a result of him being in Rome. Those would have all been important to the Colossians. No doubt they would have taken encouragement from learning that the household of Caesar and where Paul is staying is being edified in the gospel. Because it won't be long and they'll be being persecuted by those same individuals. Paul's praising Tychicus' faithfulness and gives him and blessing the message that he's carried. He's telling them that this message he's carrying, I'm giving the full weight here behind it. Not only did I write it, but I'm delivering it by his hand, and you should accept that by his hand. He is a beloved, faithful, and fellow servant. Coming from Paul, that would be pretty high praise, would it not? A well-respected individual singles you out to say he's beloved, he's faithful in the gospel, and he's a fellow servant. He's been actively working with me, not only just in delivering this letter, but he's been a fellow servant, and he is beloved. We have people that we find beloved. Brothers and sisters in Christ that we have great deal of respect for through our years, because how we have seen them conduct themselves, how they have behaved in our presence, how they have mentored or treated our children. All of those things create that type of relationship. We see Paul here expressing that same type of feeling for Tychicus. He makes the point that he's in the Lord. Tychicus is faithful in the Lord. He's not necessarily just faithful to Paul in doing what Paul asks him to do, but going beyond that, he gives a sense of what his character is with respect to how he conducts his life every day. Tychicus was sent to inform the Colossians about Paul, so they would be encouraged. Certainly, they could take the message that Paul's in prison as a downer. But Paul doesn't intend for them to feel it that way. And certainly with how the trial is going and knowing that some sense of it could have existed, that he feels like he's going to be released, because we do know that he's released after this and he does travel around on additional work, that they would have been encouraged by the status of the trial. As we go into verses 10 through 18, it is really a conclusion of the letter. And he specifically makes the effort to do a series of greetings to the brethren. Excuse me. He makes the point here that these are the individuals that are sending the greetings to them in verses 10 through 14. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. That's interesting. He's pointing out who's sending the greetings here in verses 10 through 14, and he makes a distinction about certain ones of the individuals. He makes the point here that these three individuals were Jews. Obviously, that had some meaning there. I don't know the extent of what that meaning was. We know that the Colossians consisted of both Jew and Gentile, and that there was false teaching in the area there associated with a perversion of Judaism. It could have had a sense that, okay, we have Jews here that are Christians that are working with Paul. We don't know the specific reason, but we do know that these are individuals that are with him. So Aristarchus, Mark, and Justus are pointed out. They are pointed out as being of the circumcision, and then he follows up and he talks about Epaphras, Luke, and Demas. So if we look at the next verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. Now, that kind of a greeting coming from Paul regarding Epaphras' attitude toward them shows us some important things about Epaphras' character. But what do we know about Epaphras and his relationship to those people there in Colossae? It's the one that started the church. He would have had a vested interest in praying on their behalf and keeping them in his mind and delivering this message for them. And look at the wording there specifically. He's a servant of Jesus Christ, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers. Earlier in this passage, we talked about steadfastly praying. We see a perfect example of that here in Epaphras doing that on their behalf. And it makes the point, it seems as he struggles. I'm guessing that's not that he's struggling with the desire to pray for them, but his prayer is so earnest that it's hard to do. He's putting his whole heart into it. The last part of that verse is also that you may stand mature, fully assured in all the will of God. And that specifically makes a lot of sense, knowing that he was the minister that brought them the gospel in that area. He would have had a vested interest in their well-being, for them continuing to grow and not fall to the error that's in the area. They're also pointed out as being Gentiles. They're not mentioned as being of the circumcision. So, to whom were the greetings sent? As it mentions in verse 15. In verse 15, give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea, and to Nympha and the church in her house. And when this letter has been read among you, read it to the church of the Laodiceans. So we see here the church at Laodicea is being addressed. We see here that Nymphas is being addressed, and Archippus, and, backtrack. These are individuals to whom the greetings are being sent. One's a church. No doubt the Colossians was being sent to them as a greeting as well, but two individuals included here. Verse 17, it says, and say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. Epaphras is no longer there to be able to carry on the work. We see who is carrying on that work now in Colossae in his absence. It's Archippus. Okay? Point that is... Yes. The point that Jeff's making is that in the letter to the Philemon, we can make the assumption that Archippus is Philemon's son as he's doing that work there. And the church itself was in Philemon's house. Okay. Point that Paul makes at the tail end of this in verse 18. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be to you. A personal letter seems to be very genuine, does it not? If you receive a letter and it's been printed out on a computer, do you read it the same way as if a friend sends you a handwritten letter with a note in it? Probably not, because one, you think a computer generated it or a machine generated it, and the other is by an individual's hand. There is some speculation here that Paul, in writing it with his own hand, could have been a struggle in and of itself. Maybe it would have been different. He was dictating it. We don't know what Paul's infirmities may have limited his ability to do at certain things. He makes the point specifically, though, here. He's doing it by his own hand, with his own effort, so that it is a very personal thing for them to have. When we receive a letter by someone's own hand, we oftentimes see them sign it in a signatory way. In those days and times, letters were oftentimes sealed with what? Wax. And some people placed a stamp on it to show that it was a seal of authenticity. Here, Paul's putting his stamp on what's written by stating here that he's done it with his own hand and it's being delivered to them. All the genuineness, all the sincerity that he's put into it for them to benefit from. He makes a final appeal to them as he closes out verse 17. Remember what? Remember his chains. Remember that he is in prison. Is he asking them to just remember that I'm in prison? What's he really asking for? Prayers on his behalf. Prayers that the gospel be furthered. Prayers that potentially that he be released. Prayers that he have, no doubt, remain healthy, so that once he is released, he'd be... All of these things fit together with that same idea, but remember my chains. That's correct. Being in prison wasn't, very different from a modern day prison where, yes, you're confined to an area, but you got a workout area, you got a gym, you've got television at certain times of the day, you've got plenty of food to eat, you've got restaurant facilities. None of that in the time of Paul, when a dungeon would have been a secluded area where you would have been chained to something. We do know that Paul was staying in a house, which would have been a bit different for him. I know that in other times in Paul's life, he was obviously in a prison where he was chained to someone. So, though he at this time is under house arrest, so to speak, it's certainly not the same as being able to pick up and go and do what you want to do. Comments on the book of Colossians? Oh, absolutely.
The letter was read, and I just could see from him and say, yeah, he's talking to me. I got to be nice and fair to messages.
Doug? I had not thought about the Hebrew letter and tying that together, but it's very true, and that applies across the world today as well, is that oftentimes we get lost in our own thoughts and forget about, okay, these brethren are suffering this particular thing. Remember them as if they are in their chains. That's a very good point. Anything else? Scott? No, I wouldn't imply that. I think there is an importance of the correct relationship between masters and slaves, though I will counter that Joseph was not told to go running away because he was in a relationship that he had been sold into. And we know that there were servants that were taken in under captivity, even the child that served Naaman, that continued in the household and did that in that relationship. Now, granted, Naaman took good care, but we know that Joseph's masters did not necessarily. So I think that it was a system. I don't think that it was, I think it had its abuses just as it did in our own history. But certainly, I don't know that they went so far as to being indentured servants, because they did buy and sell. That's a very good point. He came to save all mankind regardless of their condition. Thank you.
Tonight, as I knew it was coming up, I was thinking about what I would talk about tonight. And I came across an article that my father-in-law wrote about redeeming our time. And I thought I would just share a few thoughts based on his article. So how are we redeeming our time? How are we using it? Are we using it wisely, and are we using it in ways that will glorify God? Paul speaks about redeeming time in both Ephesians and Colossians. In Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 15, he says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." And in Colossians chapter 4, verse 5, he says, "Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time." The concept of redeeming time just means to make wise use of every opportunity for doing good. It's important to redeem our time by making wise use of it. And the idea of this is really emphasized when we look at the words in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." As Christians, we understand the shortness and the uncertainty and the value of time. In James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13, it says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that." Psalm 90 in verse 10 mentions that we have a relatively short life. When you look at the entirety of time, it's 70 or 80 years on average. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 15, says, "For we are aliens and pilgrims before you, as we were all our fathers. Our days on earth are as a shadow." Peter mentions a similar thought in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." The idea of our lives passing like a shadow are also repeated in Psalm 144, beginning in verse 3. "Lord, what is man, that you take knowledge of him, or the Son of Man, that you are mindful of him? Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow." Job also acknowledged the shortness of life in Job chapter 7, verse 6. "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle." As we see from these several verses, the Bible teaches us about the shortness of our days, and God shows us often in His Word that our life can be uncertain. God seems to want us all to understand that whether life is difficult or easy in the moment, He sustains life, and that our plans for our lives and for our time need to be made with if the Lord wills kind of attitude, and that times of difficulty or challenge, like what Job went through, they can cause us to notice and understand how momentary our life can be. So why does God put this idea of the shortness of time in front of us so often? And I think it's because He wants us to see the importance of using our time wisely and relying on Him and trusting Him, like Psalm 102 verse 11 says, "My days are like a shadow that lengthens, and I wither away like grass. But you, O Lord, shall endure forever, and the remembrance of your name to all generations." We are dependent on God, like Micah 6:8 says. "He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And Peter referenced the Psalms in 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 10. For he who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the days of the Lord are righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Another fact that God shows us is that we should always let Him guide us and be dependent on Him. Like in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, beginning of verse 11, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. For man also does not know his time, like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare. So the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. We know that only God knows tomorrow and what will happen tomorrow, but He does see and hear the righteous, and we know that depending on God will steer us away from life's uncertainties. So we should be redeeming our time usefully and in a way that is pleasing to God, and using it to look forward to our eternal life. If you're not a Christian or you haven't been faithful to God, the best use of your time now would be to make that right. So if you would like to do so, come as we stand and sing.